Morning, I'm out in the beautiful Surrey countryside. I've come up to a place called the Devil's Punchbowl near Hindhead in Surrey. It's a really nice area. As you can see, it is a natural bowl in the landscape that goes down, dips down in here. And what you see is over here is the old road, the old A3 that used to go between London and the south coast at Portsmouth. And time moves on, and in a few years ago they built a tunnel underneath this beautiful area, because originally the road went down to literally one lane each way and followed the side of the hill around. It was a massive congestion point on what is quite a main road here in the UK. So now they've put this tunnel in and they've grassed over the old road, and it just shows how time moves on. And it got me thinking while I'm out walking this morning. The weather's gone back to perhaps a bit more, bands of rain sweeping in from the Atlantic over the UK. But nonetheless, it's quite a beautiful area. And it got me thinking about the Z series cameras and some of the rumours that we're seeing increasingly around the Z50. The crop sensor APS-C range of mirrorless cameras that Nikon is reported to be working on. So I thought I'd just stop in a minute and just have a think about that while I was walking and give you some thoughts around it. So as I said, I thought with some of the rumours swirling around the Z50 and those rumours sort of building, it looks like Nikon are going to be releasing a crop sensor APS-C mirrorless camera in the near future. In the past I've talked about the Z5 perhaps, but what there is rumoured to be called the Z50, so where we'll see the full frame sensor mirrorless cameras with single digit Z numbers. We'll probably see the APS-C range of cameras with a 0 at the end, so a Z50 versus a Z6 in the full frame. And it got me thinking, it's likely that the Z50 will come out with a 20 megapixel sensor based on the D500 sensor, and it's aimed at replacing or being alongside the DSLRs, the D7000 range, which are at the top end of Nikon's DSLR crop sensor range. And it will be launched with a couple of lenses, likely something like a 16 to 55mm and then a 50 to 250mm. Now you've got to remember that with a crop sensor, with the Nikon crop sensors, there's a 1.5 multiplier on that, so that makes the 16 to 55 something like a 24mm to 80mm lens, which is quite a nice lens for most people. And the 50mm to 250mm would be the equivalent of about a 75mm lens up to, at its longest end, probably around a 325mm lens. So really great for sports, wildlife. And it'll be interesting to see the size and weight of those lenses, but traditionally they've been lighter than full frame lenses, because obviously of the nature of the optics required for crop sensors. So if the Z50 is aimed at replacing the D7000 range, then it's likely that the D7000 range and the D500 also use the EL15 battery, so we might see some commonality of power source with full frame sensors, which would be a real advantage and a real step forward and benefit both Nikon and the users, because if you can bring more and more of your cameras around a common power source, then you get that economies of scale. If we think about autofocus on these cameras, then the D500 I think has about 150 focus points, and the D7000 range has around about 50. We'll probably see that coming up towards the 150 focus points, I would guess, and more evenly spread across the whole sensor, as we see with other mirrorless cameras due to the technology. So that's a real step forward and a differentiator for the mirrorless versus the DSLR. If we think about the video capabilities that Nikon might build into the Z50, then we'll almost certainly see 4K, but whether that goes up to, is capped at 30 frames per second or perhaps 60 frames per second, and whether we'll see slow motion capability built in at 1080p, probably we will, because increasingly video is important. Now where the real opportunity comes is to have a common set of controls that flows the whole way through the camera range, so you can allow people to move almost seamlessly between the different crop sensor cameras and full frame cameras. Traditionally in the past, Nikon have had a slightly different approach for their professional tagged cameras to their crop sensors. However, with the Z6, Z7 release, we've seen that increasingly coming and converging with the approaches that have been on their crop sensor DSLRs, which is really good, again, from a user perspective, to allow that seamless transfer. I think it's almost certain we'll see some form of in-body image stabilization built into these cameras. It's becoming the norm with mirrorless cameras, and to not put it in, you could see Nikon getting some flack. We'll still see a single card slot, thinking of areas they've got some flack, because actually I haven't seen too much negative press since the launch of the cameras. People seem to be coping pretty well with a single XQD card slot. Whilst it's really interesting to talk about the spec sheets, for me what's really interesting is how Nikon plays their commercial strategy at this point and their approach to the market. We've got the Z7 and Z6, which are professional tagged cameras. We've then got Nikon bringing in an APS-C camera, the Z50. And where they position that versus the Z6 and Z7 will be really interesting. They've got a couple of options here, I think, in that they could continue down the route they've had in the past of the professional full-frame DSLRs were seen as almost a different range of cameras from their crop sensor DSLRs. They could continue with this, with the Z6 and Z50, and perhaps cap some of the functionality they release in the Z50 to make sure there is clear blue water in terms of spec between the Z50 and the Z6. Or they could bring together and overlap the Z6 and Z50 and allow them to have broadly similar functionality, but accept that the crop sensors could be used in different use cases. So perhaps where you want a lighter camera and you're shooting sport or wildlife, where you want to get the benefit of that crop sensor and the multiplier, the 1.5 multiplier, but don't want to carry a full frame camera. And if they did that, you could start to see, with the quality of lenses that Nikon are bringing out around their Z series, that actually the crop sensor cameras become increasingly used by certain use cases, irrespective of whether it's pro, semi-pro or amateurs. And that would be an interesting approach to the market. So I think we've got to wait and see as the rumours build and then see what Nikon actually release. But I think it's a real interesting tipping point for Nikon in their approach to the market. So it'll be really interesting times. Let me know in the comments below what you think Nikon's going to do, what you would like them to do, what you think they're going to do, and we can then look back and see what they actually do. It'd be great to hear from you. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you on future videos.